The sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty streets of Tucumcari, New Mexico territory, as Rebecca Barnes clutched her threadbare shawl tightly around her shoulders. The year was 1878, and she stood trembling on the wooden platform outside the saloon where her husband of 3 years had just wagered away the last thing of value he possessed her. Rebecca's throat constricted as she watched Samuel Wright, a tall man with a weathered face and cold eyes, count out a stack of bills before passing them to her husband, Daniel Barnes. Daniel avoided her gaze, his once handsome face now gaunt and ravaged by whiskey and gambling debts. She had known things were bad, but never imagined they would come to this, that he would sell her to cover the money he owed to men who threatened to take his life. "She's a good worker," Daniel mumbled, pocketing the money. "Keeps a clean house, don't give no trouble." Rebecca felt sick. 3 years ago, she had been a hopeful 19-year-old bride, daughter of a failed shopkeeper, marrying what seemed like a promising young rancher. Now, at 22, she was being handed over like cattle to a stranger. Samuel Wright's eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "She better be worth what I paid," he said, his voice gravelly from years of cheap cigars. "Wait." The command came from behind them, firm but not harsh. All three turned to see a man dismounting from a handsome chestnut stallion. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His clothes were well-worn but clean: a faded blue shirt, dark pants, and a dust-covered tan hat that shadowed his features. When he stepped into the light, Rebecca could see he was younger than Wright, perhaps 30 or so, with striking blue eyes that stood out against his sun-darkened skin. "I heard there was some kind of transaction going on here," the stranger said, his gaze moving from Wright to Daniel, then settling on Rebecca with a gentleness that seemed out of place in this brutal moment. Wright's posture stiffened. "This is a private business matter." "Selling a human being isn't business," the stranger said evenly, his hand resting casually near the holster at his hip. "It's something else entirely." Rebecca's husband shifted nervously. "Look, mister, I don't want no trouble. Mr. Wright here has paid fair and square." The stranger reached into his vest and pulled out a leather pouch. "How much?" Wright's eyes narrowed. $200, but she's already sold." "400, the stranger countered, tossing the pouch to Daniel. "Count it." Daniel's eyes widened as he fumbled with the drawstring and poured gold coins into his palm. He counted quickly, greed overtaking any lingering sense of shame. "It's all here," Daniel confirmed, looking up at Wright with a mixture of apology and relief. "Double what you paid." Wright's face darkened with anger. "Now see here, the lady's coming with me," the stranger said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "Unless you want to make more of this than it needs to be." Rebecca watched as Wright calculated his odds against the younger, fitter man whose stance suggested he knew how to handle himself in a fight. "Fine," Wright finally spat. "Take her. Probably more trouble than she's worth anyway." He stormed off toward the saloon, shoulders rigid with wounded pride. Daniel pocketed the money and started to shuffle away without even a glance at Rebecca. "Wait." The stranger's voice stopped him. "Aren't you going to say goodbye to your wife?" Daniel turned, his expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. "She ain't my wife no more. She's yours now. She doesn't belong to anyone," the stranger said, "least of all you." After Daniel slunk away, Rebecca found herself alone with the tall stranger. She lifted her chin, determined not to show fear despite the trembling in her legs. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The stranger removed his hat, revealing thick, sandy-colored hair. "Nothing you don't want to give, madam." He extended his hand. "My name's Seth Prescott, and all I'm asking for is your smile when you're ready to give it." Rebecca stared at him, confusion and disbelief warring in her mind. "My smile," Seth nodded. "That's all. You're free to go wherever you like. I'll provide funds for your journey if you wish to leave Tucumcari, or help you find suitable employment if you choose to stay." Rebecca's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "No man pays $400 for nothing in return." A shadow of sadness crossed Seth's face. "I've seen enough people treated as property to last a lifetime. Sometimes a man has to stand for something, even if it costs him." He replaced his hat. Now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to offer you a meal and a safe place to collect your thoughts. After that, the decision of what comes next is entirely yours. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded slowly. Whatever this man's true intentions, she had few options and even less money. And something in those steady blue eyes made her want to trust him, against all the hard lessons life had taught her. "I'd be obliged for the meal," she said quietly, "and perhaps some time to think." Seth's face brightened with the first hint of a smile. "That's all I ask, Miss Barnes," she supplied. "Rebecca Barnes." Then, after a moment's thought, she added, "For now at least." The modest hotel on the outskirts of Tucumcari was a far cry from the saloon where her life had changed so drastically just hours before. Rebecca sat across from Seth Prescott in the small dining room, picking at a plate of stew and biscuits. The few other diners paid them little mind, though the proprietress had raised an eyebrow at Seth's request for 2 separate rooms. "You should eat," Seth said gently, noticing her barely touched plate. "You'll need your strength whatever you decide to do next." Rebecca looked up at him, studying his face. In the lamplight, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, marks of someone who spent long days in the sun, but also someone who smiled often. "Why did you do it?" she asked abruptly. "The truth, please." "I've had enough lies from men to last a lifetime." Seth set down his fork and met her gaze directly. "My mother was sold to cover my father's debts when I was 8 years old. I never saw her again." His voice was steady but carried the weight of old pain. "I swore if I ever saw such a thing happening and had the means to stop it, I would." Rebecca's throat tightened. "I'm sorry about your mother." Seth nodded once, accepting her sympathy. "Life out here can be cruel, especially to those with little power, but it doesn't have to be." "And what happens now?" Rebecca asked. "You've spent a small fortune on a stranger. What do you expect in return?" "Nothing you're thinking," Seth assured her. "I own a small ranch about 2 hours' ride from here. I can offer you work as a housekeeper if you need employment, with fair wages and your own quarters. Or I can arrange passage to wherever you'd like to go, perhaps back to family." Rebecca gave a bitter laugh. "My father died last winter. My mother's been gone since I was a girl. There's no one waiting for me anywhere." Seth's expression softened with understanding. "Then you have choices to make about your future, but they're your choices now, not anyone else's." Rebecca pushed her plate away, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, hating the vulnerability in her voice. "You don't need to decide tonight," Seth said. "Rest. Things often look clearer in the morning light." As they finished their meal in companionable silence, Rebecca found herself studying this enigmatic man who had fundamentally changed her life in the span of an afternoon. He ate with the efficiency of someone used to taking meals when he could, but his manners were surprisingly refined for a frontier rancher. His hands, though calloused from work, were clean, his nails trimmed. He spoke with the education of someone who had known more than just the hard life of the territories. When they climbed the stairs to their rooms, Seth stopped at her door and handed her a small key. "Lock it," he advised. "I'm right next door if you need anything, but no one will bother you here." Rebecca took the key, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." "Seth," he corrected gently. "Good night, Rebecca. Sleep well." Alone in her room, Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, the first real bed she'd slept in for months. Daniel had lost their small homestead to creditors 6 months earlier, forcing them to rent a dilapidated one-room shack. The sheets here were clean, the quilt faded but well-mended. A small luxury that reminded her how far she had fallen and perhaps how her fortunes might be changing. She moved to the washstand and stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror. Her auburn hair hung limp around a face too thin from worry and inconsistent meals. Her green eyes, once described as lively by Daniel during their courtship, now looked wary and tired. She was only 22, but the last year had aged her. As she washed her face and hands, Rebecca tried to make sense of the day's events. Her husband had sold her to cover his gambling debts, a final betrayal in a marriage that had soured long ago. A stranger had intervened, spending an outrageous sum to free her, asking nothing in return but her smile. It seemed too impossible to believe. Men always wanted something. Daniel had wanted a wife to cook and clean and warm his bed. If this Seth Prescott truly wanted nothing from her, he would be the first man in her experience to be so selfless. As she slipped under the covers, Rebecca resolved to remain cautious. Tomorrow, she would think more clearly about her options. She could take Seth's offer of passage to another town, perhaps Denver or even Kansas City, where she might find work as a seamstress or shop girl. Or she could consider his offer of employment, though the thought of being isolated on a remote ranch with a man she barely knew gave her pause, regardless of his apparent good intentions. For tonight, however, she would allow herself the luxury of a good night's sleep in a clean bed, without fear of Daniel coming home drunk and angry. It was the first night in years she slept without dreams. Morning came with pale sunlight filtering through thin curtains. Rebecca woke disoriented before remembering where she was and how she had come to be there. She dressed quickly in her only other dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been her Sunday best, but was now worn thin at the elbows. When she emerged from her room, she found Seth waiting in the hotel's small dining area, a cup of coffee cooling before him as he read a newspaper. He stood when he saw her, folding the paper neatly. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in some time," Rebecca admitted, taking the seat he offered. The hotel proprietress brought coffee and a plate of eggs and bacon that made Rebecca's stomach growl. She hadn't had such a breakfast in months. "I need to return to my ranch today," Seth said after allowing her to eat in peace for a few minutes. "I've been away longer than planned." Rebecca felt a flutter of anxiety. "Of course, I understand you have responsibilities." "I've spoken with Mrs. Holloway, the owner here," Seth continued. "She's agreed to let you stay for up to a week, all expenses covered if you need time to consider your options." Rebecca set down her fork. "That's very generous." "It's practical," Seth replied with a small smile. "Important decisions shouldn't be rushed." Rebecca studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. In the morning light, she could see his features more clearly: the straight nose, firm jaw, and those remarkably blue eyes that seemed to see more than most. "What if I decide to accept your offer of employment?" she asked cautiously. "Then I'll return for you at week's end," he said simply. "My ranch is modest but comfortable. I have a small herd of cattle, some horses, and enough land to grow what I need. The house has 3 bedrooms, one would be yours entirely. Your duties would be cooking, cleaning, and helping with some of the garden work. In exchange, you'd receive room, board, and $20 a month." Rebecca nearly choked on her coffee. $20 a month was a generous wage for a housekeeper, especially one provided with room and board. "And if I choose to go elsewhere?" she pressed. Seth reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small envelope, sliding it across the table. "This should cover your passage to any major city within 300 miles, plus enough to see you settled for a few weeks while you find work." Rebecca didn't touch the envelope. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Seth's expression grew thoughtful. "When I was a boy, after my mother was taken, a stranger helped me find my way. An old trapper who could have left me to fend for myself instead taught me to hunt, to read, to survive. He expected nothing in return except that someday I'd do the same for someone else in need." He paused. "I've tried to live by that." Rebecca felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the wall of distrust she had built around herself. "I don't know if I'm worth all this trouble," she said softly. Seth's gaze was steady. "Every person is worth the trouble, Rebecca. Some just haven't been shown that yet." After breakfast, Seth walked Rebecca back to her room. "I've paid for your meals as well as the room," he explained. "If you need anything else, Mrs. Holloway will arrange it." At her door, he hesitated. "I hope to see you again, but I'll understand if you choose another path." Rebecca found herself not wanting him to leave just yet. "Your ranch, what is it called?" A smile warmed his features. "Sunrise Ranch. It sits in a valley that catches the first light of day." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Rebecca." She watched him walk away, his stride confident but unhurried. Through the window at the end of the hall, she observed him mount his chestnut horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. As he rode away, Rebecca felt a curious mixture of relief and loss. The next days passed in a strange limbo. Rebecca explored the small town of Tucumcari, careful to avoid the saloon where her husband might still be gambling away his ill-gotten gains. She visited the general store, the small church, and even the schoolhouse, watching the children play during their noon recess with a pang of what might have been. Each night, she returned to the hotel and carefully counted the money Seth had left her, considering her options. She could go to Santa Fe, or perhaps all the way to Denver. She had skills she could sew well enough, and her mother had taught her to keep accounts neatly. But each time she contemplated leaving, she found herself thinking of Seth Prescott's offer. $20 a month would allow her to save enough to truly start over within a year. And something about his quiet strength and integrity called to her in a way she couldn't quite explain. On the fourth day, as Rebecca sat on a bench outside the general store, she heard a familiar voice that made her blood run cold. "Well, if it ain't my darling wife." Daniel stood before her, swaying slightly, his clothes more rumpled than ever. The smell of whiskey hung about him like a cloud. Rebecca stood, glancing around for an escape route. "I'm not your wife anymore, Daniel. You sold that right along with me," he snorted. "Still got a sharp tongue on you. That cowboy'll beat that out soon enough." "Mr. Prescott is a gentleman," Rebecca said coldly. "Something you wouldn't recognize." Daniel's face darkened. "You think you're too good for me now. That rich rancher's got you feeling high and mighty." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know what you really are, just a poor shopkeeper's daughter, lucky I ever looked at you twice." Rebecca stood her ground, though her heart hammered in her chest. "I think you should leave me alone, Daniel. Our business is finished." "Maybe I ain't finished with you," he growled, grabbing her arm. "Maybe I want what's mine back. You'll want to let the lady go." The new voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel. Rebecca looked up to see the town marshal, a weathered man with graying hair at his temples, standing a few paces away, his hand resting on his holster. "This is between me and my wife, Marshal," Daniel said, not releasing his grip. "I understand Mrs. Barnes is no longer your wife," the marshal replied evenly. "And that you received payment twice over for relinquishing any claim to her. Is that not correct?" Daniel's grip loosened in surprise. "How'd you know about that? This is my town, Barnes." "Not much happens here I don't hear about." The marshal's eyes were cold. "Now, I suggest you move along before I decide to run you in for disturbing the peace." Daniel released Rebecca's arm, shooting her a venomous look. "This ain't over." "Yes, it is," the marshal countered. "Unless you want me to have a conversation with you about the legality of selling human beings in the New Mexico territory. I imagine the territorial judge would be mighty interested in such a case." Color drained from Daniel's face. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, heading in the direction of the saloon. The marshal turned to Rebecca. "You all right, madam?" "Yes, thank you, Marshal." She trailed off, realizing she didn't know his name. "Holloway," he supplied. "James Holloway. You're related to Mrs. Holloway at the hotel?" Rebecca asked. He nodded. "My sister-in-law, she mentioned you were staying with us, said Seth Prescott had arranged it." "You know Mr. Prescott?" Rebecca couldn't hide her curiosity. "Known him since he came to these parts 5 years back," Marshal Holloway confirmed. "Good man, keeps to himself mostly, but fair in his dealings. Built that ranch of his from nothing but determination and hard work." He touched the brim of his hat. "If you have trouble with Barnes again, you let me know. Though I expect he'll be moving on soon, not many here willing to extend him credit anymore." As the marshal walked away, Rebecca felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Daniel was still in town, but now she had confirmation from a seemingly reliable source that Seth Prescott was indeed respected in the community. It wasn't much, but it helped ease some of her lingering doubts. That night, as she lay in her hotel bed, Rebecca made her decision. Tomorrow, she would ask Mrs. Holloway to send word to Seth that she would accept his offer of employment. She would give herself 1 year at Sunrise Ranch time to save money and consider her future with more security than she had known in a long while. What she would not admit to herself was how much she looked forward to seeing those blue eyes again. Seth Prescott arrived in Tucumcari exactly 1 week after he had left, just as promised. Rebecca waited in the hotel lobby, her few belongings packed in a small carpet bag. She had used a small portion of Seth's money to purchase a new dress, a practical brown calico with white trim and a sturdy pair of boots. The remainder she had carefully sewn into the lining of her bag. When Seth walked through the door, he removed his hat, revealing hair still damp from a recent washing. He had trimmed his beard as well, Rebecca noticed, and wore a clean shirt under his familiar tan vest. "You're still here," he said, and she couldn't miss the pleased note in his voice. "I've decided to accept your offer," Rebecca replied, standing a little straighter. "For a trial period of 1 year, if that suits you." Seth's smile warmed his entire face. "It suits me fine. I'm glad you're coming, Rebecca, Mrs. Holloway emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ah, Seth, right on time as always. I see Miss Barnes is ready to depart." "She is," Seth confirmed. "Thank you for looking after her, Martha." "It was no trouble at all, Mrs. Holloway assured him, giving Rebecca a maternal pat on the arm. "She's been a perfect guest, quiet as a church mouse but pleasant company when she does speak up." Rebecca felt a blush warm her cheeks at the praise. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Holloway." Outside, Seth's chestnut stallion waited, along with a smaller, dappled mare. "I brought Lady for you," Seth explained, taking Rebecca's bag and securing it behind the mare's saddle. "She's gentle but sure-footed. The trail to the ranch crosses some rough country." Rebecca approached the mare cautiously. It had been years since she'd ridden, and never a horse this fine. The animal regarded her with intelligent brown eyes, then lowered its head to snuffle at her hand. "She likes you," Seth observed. "That's a good sign." He helped Rebecca mount, adjusting the stirrups to suit her height. His hands were strong but gentle, and she found herself acutely aware of his proximity as he checked the saddle's girth. "Comfortable?" he asked, looking up at her. Rebecca nodded, not trusting her voice for a moment. She had not been treated with such consideration in longer than she could remember. Seth mounted his own horse, and they set off at an easy pace. As they left the town behind, Rebecca felt a curious mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She was riding into the unknown with a man she barely knew, yet somehow she felt safer than she had in years. The landscape opened before them, vast expanses of scrubby plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. In the distance, purple mountains shimmered in the heat haze. The enormity of the land made Rebecca feel small, yet strangely free. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Seth glanced over at her, his expression thoughtful. "It can be harsh too. Winters bring bitter cold, summers scorching heat. But there's an honesty to this country I've never found elsewhere." "How did you come to settle here?" Rebecca asked, curious about this man who had so dramatically altered the course of her life. Seth guided his horse around a patch of rocky ground before answering. "After my mother was taken, I spent years drifting. The old trapper who took me in taught me to survive, but he was nomadic by nature. When he passed, I kept moving, working cattle drives, breaking horses, taking whatever honest work I could find." He paused, his gaze distant. "5 years ago, I was driving a small herd north and stumbled across the valley where my ranch now sits. Something about that place spoke to me. I used every cent I'd saved to make a down payment on the land, built the cabin with my own hands, and started with just 10 head of cattle and 2 horses. A smile touched his lips. Now I have 60 head and 8 horses, including these 2. Rebecca was impressed despite herself. "You've accomplished a great deal in a short time." "Hard work and a bit of luck," Seth said modestly, "and good neighbors. The Mendez family to the south has been particularly helpful. Elena Mendez will likely come by once she hears I've hired help. She's appointed herself my guardian angel since I helped her son with a broken arm last winter." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves creating a soothing backdrop to Rebecca's thoughts. The sun was beginning its westward descent when Seth pointed to a gap between 2 hills ahead. "We're nearly there," he said. Sunrise Ranch lies just beyond that pass. As they rode through the natural gateway, Rebecca caught her breath at the view that opened before her. A verdant valley stretched perhaps 2 miles long and 1 mile wide, bisected by a clear stream that gleamed silver in the late afternoon light. On the eastern side, a modest but well-built cabin stood near a large barn and corral. Beyond these, cattle grazed on lush grass, their coats reddish-brown against the green. "Welcome to Sunrise Ranch," Seth said, a note of pride in his voice. As they drew closer, Rebecca could see a vegetable garden beside the cabin, rows of corn, beans, and other crops growing in neat rows. A chicken coop stood nearby, and she could hear the clucking of hens inside. "It's lovely," she said honestly. After the cramped squalor of the shack she had shared with Daniel these past months, the well-maintained property seemed like paradise. Seth dismounted and came to help her down from her horse. His hands at her waist were steady and respectful, but Rebecca couldn't help noticing the strength in them or the way her heart quickened at his proximity. "Let me show you the house," he offered after tending to both horses. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from a distance, solidly built of pine logs with a proper stone chimney. Inside, Rebecca found a main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, a cushioned rocker, and bookshelves filled with more volumes than she had seen outside of a schoolhouse. A kitchen area occupied one corner with a cast iron stove, a dry sink, and open shelving holding dishes and cooking equipment. "The bedrooms are through here," Seth said, leading her down a short hallway. "Mine is at the end. This one will be yours." He opened a door to reveal a simply furnished but clean room with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a basin and pitcher. A colorful quilt covered the bed, and curtains of the same fabric hung at the window. "Elena made those," Seth explained, gesturing to the quilt and curtains. "She said the room needed a woman's touch. I believe she was hoping I'd find a wife to fill it someday." Rebecca felt a blush rise to her cheeks at the implication. "It's very nice, thank you." "The third room I use for storage mostly," Seth continued, moving past an awkward moment. "But it could be made up as a guest room if needed." Back in the main room, Seth built a small fire to take the chill off the evening air, then began preparing a simple supper. Rebecca moved to help him, and they worked together in a surprisingly comfortable rhythm, he slicing bacon while she peeled potatoes, he fetching water from the pump outside while she set the table. As they ate, Rebecca found herself relaxing for the first time in what felt like years. The food was simple but good, and Seth's company was undemanding. He spoke of practical matters, her duties, the schedule of the ranch, the location of supplies, but also shared small stories about the animals and his neighbors. After supper, Seth showed her the root cellar behind the house where vegetables and preserves were stored, then walked her around the yard, pointing out the tool shed, the smokehouse, and the spring house where milk and butter were kept cool. "I usually rise before dawn," he explained as twilight deepened around them. "The coffee will be on by the time you wake. Breakfast is simple most days, just biscuits and bacon or eggs. Dinner is our main meal, with supper being leftovers or something light." Rebecca nodded, taking mental notes. "Is there laundry to be done tomorrow?" "No rush," Seth assured her. "Take a day or two to settle in. Laundry day is usually Saturday if that suits." As darkness fell, they returned to the cabin. Seth lit a lamp and placed it on the table before retrieving a ledger from a shelf. "I keep accounts of everything," he said, opening the book to show her neat columns of figures. "You're welcome to review them anytime. Your wages will be recorded here, paid at month's end." Rebecca was touched by his transparency. Daniel had never allowed her to see their financial matters, even when they were losing everything. "Thank you for your trust," she said quietly. Seth closed the ledger. "Trust works both ways, Rebecca. I hope in time you'll find you can trust me as well." Their eyes met across the table, and Rebecca felt something stir inside her, a fragile, tentative hope that perhaps her life could be different than it had been. "I should turn in," she said, breaking the moment. "It's been a long day," Seth nodded. "Of course. Sleep well, Rebecca." In her room, Rebecca changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the colorful quilt. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the vast New Mexico sky like diamonds on black velvet. The silence was profound after the constant noise of town. No piano from the saloon, no shouts or laughter from the street, just the occasional lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through pine needles. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca fell asleep feeling safe. The days at Sunrise Ranch quickly settled into a rhythm that Rebecca found both demanding and satisfying. She rose each morning to find Seth had already been up for an hour or more, the coffee pot bubbling on the stove and fresh eggs collected from the chicken coop. After breakfast, Seth would head out to tend the cattle or work the fields, while Rebecca turned to household chores: sweeping, dusting, bread-making, mending. The work was hard but purposeful, and Seth was always appreciative of her efforts. "Best meal I've had in years," he declared on the third night when she prepared a venison stew with dumplings. His genuine enjoyment of her cooking gave Rebecca a sense of pride she had almost forgotten. As promised, Elena Mendez appeared at the end of Rebecca's first week, arriving on horseback with her teenage son Miguel and a basket of freshly baked tortillas and spicy beans. "So Seth has finally found someone to civilize this bachelor home," Elena exclaimed, embracing Rebecca as though they were old friends rather than strangers. A handsome woman in her 40s with glossy black hair streaked with silver, Elena had a warmth that immediately put Rebecca at ease. "Mrs. Barnes is my housekeeper," Seth explained, though his ears reddened slightly at Elena's knowing smile. "Of course," Elena said, winking at Rebecca. "And such a lovely housekeeper she is. You must come to Sunday dinner at our rancho, both of you. My husband Javier will be most pleased to meet you." That Sunday dinner became a regular tradition. The Mendez family, Elena, Javier, Miguel, and their daughter Lucia, welcomed Rebecca as though she had always been part of their circle. Their adobe ranch house, larger and more established than Seth's cabin, rang with laughter and conversation during these gatherings. Rebecca found herself smiling more, speaking more freely, rediscovering parts of herself that had withered during her marriage to Daniel. "You look happier," Seth observed one evening as they rode home from the Mendez ranch under a sky painted with the oranges and purples of sunset. "It suits you." Rebecca glanced over at him, noting how the fading light gilded his profile. "I am happier," she admitted. "I didn't expect to be." As summer turned to early autumn, Rebecca found herself watching Seth when he didn't notice. The way his hands, strong and capable, could be so gentle when delivering a calf or tending an injured bird that had fallen from its nest. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The way he always treated her with respect, never raising his voice or making her feel less than his equal despite her position as his employee. She began to notice, too, how he would sometimes pause in his work to watch her hang laundry or gather vegetables from the garden. How he would find small ways to make her life easier, building shelves in the kitchen to better organize her supplies, carving a rolling pin when she mentioned wanting to make pie crust, bringing wildflowers from the hills to brighten the table. These small kindnesses, so different from anything she had known with Daniel, caused something to bloom within Rebecca's heart, something she was afraid to name. September brought the first hints of autumn to the high country. Aspen trees on the mountainsides turned golden, and mornings arrived with a crisp edge that spoke of winter's approach. Seth worked longer hours, preparing the ranch for the coming cold, repairing the barn roof, splitting firewood that he stacked in neat cords against the cabin wall, smoking meat, and putting up preserves with Rebecca's help. "First snow usually comes by late October," he explained as they worked together to bring in the last of the garden harvest. "Once it starts, we could be snowed in for days at a time." Rebecca's hands stilled on the carrot she was pulling from the earth. Snowed in. The implication of being confined in the cabin alone with Seth for days made her pulse quicken in a way that was not entirely from fear. Seth seemed to read her thoughts. "The Mendez Ranch is close enough to reach in all but the worst blizzards," he assured her. "And I've made arrangements with Reverend Thomas from town to stay here if conditions make it necessary for propriety's sake." Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and something that might have been disappointment. "You've thought of everything." Seth smiled, that warm expression that reached his eyes and made her stomach flutter. "I try to. Out here, preparation is often the difference between comfort and calamity." As they worked side by side in the garden, their hands occasionally brushed, sending shivers up Rebecca's arm that had nothing to do with the cool air. She found herself wondering what it would be like if Seth saw her as more than his housekeeper, if he might someday look at her with more than kindness in those blue eyes. But she didn't dare hope for such things. He had been clear from the beginning about the nature of their arrangement, and she would not risk the security and peace she had found at Sunrise Ranch by allowing herself to want more. October brought a cattle buyer from Colorado, a boisterous man named Jenkins who stayed 2 nights at the ranch while he and Seth negotiated the sale of 20 head. Rebecca served meals and kept the house in order, but stayed mostly in the background, uncomfortable with the way Jenkins's eyes followed her movements. On the second night, after Seth had walked Jenkins to the bunkhouse where he would sleep, he returned to find Rebecca clearing the supper dishes with quick, agitated movements. "He bothered you," Seth said, not a question but a statement. Rebecca kept her eyes on her task. "It's nothing." "I'm used to men like him." Seth's hand covered hers, stilling her nervous motion. "You shouldn't have to be used to it, and not under my roof." Rebecca looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice. "You can't control how other men behave." "I can control who I do business with," Seth said firmly. "Jenkins won't be welcome back here. But the cattle sale, there are other buyers." Seth's expression softened. "Your comfort and safety matter more than a few dollars." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes at his declaration. Daniel would have laughed at her discomfort, perhaps even encouraged Jenkins's attention if he thought it might lead to a better price for the cattle. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say more around the sudden lump in her throat. Seth's hand remained on hers a moment longer, warm and reassuring, then he withdrew it, stepping back slightly. "I'll finish here," he said. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be busy after Jenkins leaves." That night, Rebecca lay awake long after she had blown out her lamp, her hand still tingling where Seth had touched it, her heart full of feelings she was finally beginning to acknowledge. The first snow came earlier than expected mid-October instead of late in the month. Rebecca woke to a world transformed, the valley blanketed in white that glittered in the morning sun. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch, her breath catching at the beauty before her. Seth emerged from the barn, carrying a bucket of milk from the cow they kept for fresh dairy. He paused when he saw her, his figure stark against the pristine landscape. "First snow," he called, a boyish grin lighting his face. "What do you think?" "It's beautiful," Rebecca replied, smiling at his enthusiasm. Seth set down the milk bucket and scooped up a handful of snow, forming it into a perfect ball. "We used to have snowball fights when I was a boy," he said, tossing the ball lightly from hand to hand, "before everything changed." The reference to his childhood, so rarely mentioned, touched Rebecca deeply. Impulsively, she reached down to gather her own handful of snow, packing it quickly and hurling it toward him before she could reconsider. Her aim was true, the snowball caught Seth squarely in the chest. He stood stock still for a moment, his expression one of complete surprise. Then he threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing across the silent, snow-covered valley. "So that's how it is," he said, his eyes sparkling with mischief as he formed another snowball. Rebecca had only a moment to duck before it sailed past her head. She grabbed more snow, packing it hastily, and soon they were engaged in a full-fledged snowball fight, laughing like children as they chased each other around the yard. When a well-aimed throw from Seth caught her on the shoulder, Rebecca lost her footing on the slippery ground. She would have fallen if Seth hadn't lunged forward to catch her, his strong arms wrapping around her waist and pulling her against his chest. Suddenly they were very close, their breath mingling in small white clouds between them. Seth's arms remained around her, steadying her, but his eyes had grown serious, searching her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "Rebecca," he said softly, her name almost a question on his lips. Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats broke the stillness. They sprang apart as Alina's son Miguel appeared on horseback, waving as he approached. "Mr. Prescott. Mama sent me to invite you both for supper tonight before the snow gets deeper." Seth cleared his throat, composure returning to his features. "Thank Miguel. Tell your mother we'll be there." As Miguel rode away, an awkward silence fell between them. Seth picked up the forgotten milk bucket. "I should get this inside before it freezes," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Yes, of course, Rebecca murmured, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, suddenly aware of the cold. That evening at the Mendez ranch, Rebecca found herself seated beside Lucia, Alina's 18-year-old daughter, while the men discussed the early snow and its implications for the winter ahead. "You are good for him," Lucia said suddenly in a low voice, nodding toward Seth, who was deep in conversation with Javier. Rebecca startled. "I don't know what you mean," Lucia smiled knowingly. "Before you came, Mr. Prescott was like a shadow always working, never smiling. Now he laughs. His eyes follow you when you're not looking. We have a professional arrangement," Rebecca insisted, though she felt heat rising to her cheeks. "Perhaps," Lucia said, unconvinced, "but I see how you look at him too." Before Rebecca could formulate a response, Alina called them to help bring the food to the table, saving her from having to address Lucia's observations. Later that night, as Seth and Rebecca rode home under a sky brilliant with stars, the awkwardness from the morning's encounter had dissipated, replaced by a comfortable silence. The horses moved slowly through the new snow, their breath visible in the cold air. "I'm glad you're here, Rebecca," Seth said suddenly, his voice quiet in the stillness. Rebecca looked over at him, his profile illuminated by moonlight reflected off the snow. "I'm glad to be here," she replied honestly. "I know this isn't what you imagined for your life," he continued. "But I hope you've found some happiness here." "More than I dared hope for," Rebecca admitted. Seth turned to look at her then, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "The year you agreed to is half over. Have you thought about what comes after?" Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. "Not specifically, have you?" Seth was silent for a long moment. "I've grown accustomed to having you at Sunrise Ranch. The thought of you leaving troubles me." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was something in acknowledgement that she had become more than just an employee to him. "I'm not planning to leave when the year is up," Rebecca said softly. "Not unless you want me to." Relief washed over Seth's features. "I don't want that, not at all." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but something had shifted between them. A door had opened, just slightly, to possibilities neither had allowed themselves to consider before. The weeks that followed brought more snow and increasingly cold temperatures. Life at the ranch settled into its winter rhythm slower, more confined, but with its own quiet pleasures. Evenings were spent by the fire, Seth often reading aloud from one of his books while Rebecca mended or knitted. On Sundays, weather permitting, they attended the small church in a neighboring settlement, then visited the Mendez family for dinner. Late November brought an unexpected visitor to Sunrise Ranch. Marshall Holloway, arriving on horseback during a break in the snow. "Thought I should let you know," he said as they sat at the kitchen table, warming himself with coffee Rebecca had poured. "Daniel Barnes left town about a month back, but he's been seen in Santa Fe, telling anyone who'll listen that Seth stole his wife." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. "He has no claim on me anymore. He sold that right, as you yourself pointed out to him." "That's true enough," Marshall Holloway agreed, "but a man's pride can make him dangerous, especially when whiskey's involved. And Barnes has been drinking heavily, from what I hear." Seth's expression had hardened at the mention of Daniel. "Has he made any specific threats?" "Nothing direct," the marshal replied, "but I thought you should be aware, take extra precautions. Winter will keep him away for now, most likely, but come spring." He let the implication hang. After the marshal departed, Rebecca stood at the window, watching snow begin to fall again, a cold knot of fear forming in her stomach. The happiness she had found at Sunrise Ranch suddenly felt fragile, threatened. "He won't hurt you again," Seth said, coming to stand beside her. "I won't let that happen." Rebecca turned to face him. "It's not just me I'm worried about. Daniel is unpredictable when he's been drinking. If he came here—" "I can handle Daniel Barnes," Seth assured her, his voice steady. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me," Rebecca said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Seth's expression softened. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Nothing's going to happen to either of us, but it means a great deal to hear you say that." His touch was gentle, his eyes warm with an emotion Rebecca was beginning to recognize and to hope might be reflected in her own. December brought Christmas preparations. Elena taught Rebecca to make traditional Mexican Christmas dishes: tamales wrapped in corn husks, sweet empanadas filled with pumpkin and spices. Seth returned from a trip to Tucumcari with small gifts for the Mendez family, and a package he hid away, refusing to let Rebecca see it. "For Christmas," he said with a mysterious smile that made her wonder and anticipate, on Christmas Eve, they joined the Mendez family for Noche Buena celebrations, a feast followed by midnight mass at the small adobe church. The building glowed with candlelight, the simple service conducted in a mixture of Spanish and English that somehow made the familiar words new and meaningful to Rebecca. As they rode home afterward, snow began to fall again, large, lazy flakes that drifted down in the stillness of the night. "Merry Christmas, Rebecca," Seth said as they reached the ranch, the cabin a dark silhouette against the snowy landscape. "Merry Christmas," she replied, happiness bubbling up inside her despite the late hour and the cold. Inside, Seth built up the fire while Rebecca lit lamps, casting the cabin in a warm glow. When the chill had been banished from the room, Seth disappeared briefly into his bedroom, returning with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red string. "I know it's traditional to wait until morning," he said, offering it to her, "but I'd like you to have this now." Rebecca accepted the package, surprised by its weight. Carefully untying the string, she unwrapped the paper to reveal a book bound in soft leather. Opening it, she found blank pages of creamy paper. "A journal," Seth explained. "I noticed you sometimes write on scraps of paper in the evenings. I thought you might like something proper to keep your thoughts in." Rebecca ran her fingers over the supple leather, deeply touched by his thoughtfulness. "It's beautiful, thank you." "There's something else," Seth said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small object and held it out to her, a silver locket on a delicate chain. Rebecca's breath caught as she accepted it, opening the tiny clasp to find it empty inside. "For memories yet to be made," Seth said softly, "if you'll allow me to be part of them." Rebecca looked up at him, her heart pounding. "Seth, I didn't bring you here intending this," he said, his voice low and earnest. "But these months with you. Rebecca, you've brought light and warmth to this house, to my life. I find myself hoping for more than our original arrangement." Rebecca closed her fingers around the locket. "What are you asking?" Seth took a step closer. "I'm asking if you might consider staying at Sunrise Ranch not as my housekeeper but as my wife. Not now, I know you need time after what you've been through. But someday, when you're ready, if you could ever feel for me what I've come to feel for you." Tears filled Rebecca's eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of overwhelming emotion. "I already do," she whispered, Seth's face transformed with hope and joy. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss that held both question and promise. When they parted, Rebecca smiled, a full, genuine smile that came from deep within her heart. "You once said all you asked for was my smile when I was ready to give it." Seth's eyes were bright with emotion as he traced her cheek with gentle fingers. "Your smile is more precious to me than gold, Rebecca. Always has been from the first moment." They stood together before the fire, the first tentative step taken on a new path neither had imagined when fate first brought them together on that dusty street in Tucumcari. Winter deepened, bringing January blizzards that confined them to the ranch for days at a time. The close quarters might have been awkward after their Christmas Eve declarations, but instead, Rebecca found a new ease developing between them. Seth was unfailingly respectful, never presuming upon her newly acknowledged feelings, but small changes marked their evolving relationship, hands that touched briefly while passing dishes at the table, conversations that lingered late into the evening, shared laughter over small domestic mishaps. "I want to court you properly," Seth explained one evening as they sat before the fire, his book forgotten in his lap. "Not rush you into anything." Rebecca appreciated his patience, even as she found herself increasingly drawn to him. Her marriage to Daniel had begun with impetuous passion that quickly cooled to indifference and finally contempt. What was growing between her and Seth felt entirely different, a steady warmth that deepened with each passing day, built on foundation of genuine respect and caring. February brought Valentine's Day, and with it, Seth's first formal gesture of courtship, a small wooden box he had carved himself, decorated with intricate patterns of leaves and flowers. "For your special keepsakes," he said, watching her trace the designs with wondering fingers. "It's exquisite," Rebecca marveled. "I didn't know you could carve like this." "My father taught me before." Seth rarely spoke of his father, and Rebecca didn't press. Instead, she placed the silver locket he had given her at Christmas inside the box, her most precious possession. March arrived with warming temperatures, and the first signs of spring crocuses pushing through melting snow, longer days, the return of birds from their winter migrations. As the snow receded, Seth began preparations for spring planting and calving season, the busiest time of year on the ranch. One mild afternoon, as Rebecca hung washing on the line behind the house, she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Expecting to see Miguel Mendez or perhaps Marshall Holloway, she shaded her eyes against the sun to see the rider. Her blood ran cold when she recognized Daniel. He rode a scrawny nag, his clothes even more disheveled than when she had last seen him, his face unshaven and bitter. He pulled his horse to a stop a few yards away, swaying slightly in the saddle. "Well, well," he said, his voice slurred with whiskey even at this early hour. "Playing the happy homemaker, are we?" Rebecca glanced toward the north pasture where Seth had gone to check on a pregnant heifer. He was too far away to call. "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's rightfully mine?" he snarled, dismounting unsteadily. "You made me look like a fool, Rebecca, running off with that high and mighty rancher." "I didn't run off with anyone," Rebecca countered, backing toward the house. "You sold me. Seth paid you fair and square." Daniel spat on the ground. "Nothing fair about it. He humiliated me, took what was mine." He started toward her, his gait uneven but purposeful. "Now I'm going to take you back." Rebecca turned to run for the house, but Daniel lunged forward with surprising speed, grabbing her arm and yanking her back. "Let go of me," she cried, struggling against his grip. "You're still my wife in the eyes of God," Daniel hissed, his breath foul with whiskey. "No piece of paper or money changing hands changes that. Let her go, Barnes." Seth's voice, cold and commanding, came from behind them. Rebecca turned her head to see him standing a few yards away, rifle in hand, his expression more dangerous than she had ever seen it. Daniel's grip tightened painfully on Rebecca's arm. "This doesn't concern you, Prescott. This is between me and my wife." "Rebecca isn't your wife," Seth said evenly. "She isn't your property, she never was. Now let her go before I make you regret coming here." Daniel's face twisted with rage. "You think you're better than me, don't you, with your fancy ranch and your books? You're just a man like any other, and she's nothing but a—" "Finish that sentence and it will be your last," Seth interrupted, raising the rifle to his shoulder. Rebecca could feel Daniel's indecision in the trembling of his hand on her arm. Then abruptly he shoved her away from him, sending her stumbling to the ground. "Fine, keep her," Daniel spat. "She was never worth the trouble anyway." Seth's expression didn't change. "Get on your horse and ride out, Barnes. Don't ever come back. Next time I won't be so forgiving." Daniel glared at them both, hatred and whiskey burning in his bloodshot eyes. For a moment, Rebecca feared he might do something reckless, but ultimately self-preservation won out. He turned, staggered to his horse, and mounted clumsily. "This isn't over," he threatened as he wheeled the horse around. "Yes, it is," Seth replied with finality. "Marshall Holloway and Judge Wilson will be very interested to hear about your attempt to reclaim a woman you legally sold. Kidnapping carries a heavy sentence in the territory." Daniel's face paled slightly. Without another word, he dug his heels into his horse's flanks and rode away. Seth waited until Daniel was well down the road before lowering his rifle and hurrying to Rebecca's side, helping her to her feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Rebecca shook her head, though her arm throbbed where Daniel had gripped it. "Just shaken." Seth's face was grim as he looked in the direction Daniel had disappeared. "I should have expected he might come once the pass is cleared. I'm sorry, Rebecca. I shouldn't have left you alone. You couldn't have known," she said, placing her hand on his arm, "and you can't stay by my side every moment." Seth covered her hand with his. "I'm riding to the Mendez ranch to send Miguel for the marshal." Then I'm taking you to stay with Alina until we're sure Barnes has left the territory for good." Rebecca wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't afraid, but the truth was Daniel's appearance had shaken her deeply. She nodded her agreement, and within the hour, they were riding toward the Mendez ranch, leaving the washing forgotten on the line. Elena welcomed them with open arms, her motherly concern enveloping Rebecca like a warm blanket. Miguel rode immediately to alert Marshal Holloway, while Javier and his ranch hands organized a watch rotation to ensure Daniel didn't return to Sunrise Ranch or approach the Mendez property. Rebecca spent 3 days with the Mendez family while Seth, Marshal Holloway, and several other local ranchers searched the area for Daniel. They found evidence he had camped briefly in the hills overlooking Sunrise Ranch, suggesting he had been watching the property for at least a day before approaching a thought that sent chills down Rebecca's spine. On the 4th day, news came from Tucumcari that Daniel had been seen boarding a train heading east after selling his horse for barely enough to cover the ticket. Marshal Holloway confirmed the report personally before riding to the Mendez ranch. "I think it's safe for you to return home now," he told Seth and Rebecca. Barnes seemed genuinely frightened by the mention of kidnapping charges. "My guess is he'll think twice before showing his face in this territory again." That evening, Seth and Rebecca rode back to Sunrise Ranch, arriving as the setting sun painted the valley in hues of gold and pink. The familiar sight of the cabin, the barn, the corrals all filled Rebecca with a profound sense of homecoming. "I was afraid," she admitted as they unsaddled the horses together in the barn. "Not just of Daniel, but of how it would feel to come back here after what happened." Seth paused in his work, watching her face carefully. "And how does it feel?" Rebecca looked around the barn, then through the open door to the cabin beyond. "Like coming home," she said softly. "The only real home I've known since my father died." Seth set down the saddle blanket he was holding and moved to stand before her. "It is your home, Rebecca. For as long as you want it to be." She looked up at him, seeing the love in his eyes that he had been careful not to press upon her these past months. "What I want," she said slowly, finding certainty with each word, "is to be here with you. Not just as your housekeeper or even as your sweetheart, but as your wife, if that offer still stands." Joy transformed Seth's face. "It stands, it always will." He took her hands in his. "Are you certain? After everything with Daniel, I'd understand if you wanted to wait longer." Rebecca shook her head. "Daniel made me doubt myself, doubt my worth. You helped me find it again. I don't want to wait any longer to begin our life together, truly together." Seth's smile was radiant as he drew her gently into his arms. "Then we won't wait. We'll speak to Reverend Thomas this Sunday." Their kiss, there in the barn with the day's last light streaming through the open doors, held all the promise of the future they would build together, a future founded not on ownership or obligation, but on love freely given and joyfully received. The wedding took place on the first Sunday in May, when the valley was alive with wildflowers and new growth. The small church was filled to capacity with well-wishers, the Mendez family in the front row, Marshal Holloway and his sister-in-law Martha, ranchers and townsfolk who had come to respect Seth, and over time, Rebecca as well. Elena and Lucia had helped Rebecca make her wedding dress, a simple gown of ivory cotton with lace trim, salvaged from Elena's own wedding dress. Rebecca wore wildflowers in her hair and Seth's silver locket around her neck, now containing a small portrait of him that a traveling photographer had taken in Tucumcari the month before. Seth, standing at the altar in a new black suit, watched with undisguised adoration as Rebecca walked toward him on Javier Mendez's arm. When they joined hands before Reverend Thomas, Rebecca felt a completeness she had never known, as if a piece of herself that had been missing was finally restored. "I take you, Rebecca Barnes, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Seth vowed, his voice clear and strong in the hushed church. "To have and to hold from this day forward, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as we both shall live." When Rebecca repeated the vows, replacing his name with hers, her voice trembled slightly with emotion, but her eyes never left his. The gold band Seth placed on her finger had belonged to his mother. He had told her privately recovered by the old trapper who had taken him in after she was sold away. I promised myself I would give it only to a woman who would never be owned, but who would choose freely to share her life with me, he had explained when showing it to her. As Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Seth leaned down to kiss his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to even Alina's eyes. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers as they turned to face their friends as Mr. and Mrs. Prescott. The celebration continued at Sunrise Ranch, where tables had been set up in the yard under trees beginning to leaf out with spring green. Mexican music played by Javier's brother and cousins filled the air as people ate, drank, and danced well into the evening. Rebecca moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and good wishes, Seth never far from her side, his hand often finding hers as if to reassure himself of her presence. As twilight descended, guests began to depart, calling final congratulations and blessings. The Mendez family was the last to leave, Alina embracing Rebecca tightly. "Be happy, my Hija," she whispered. "You deserve every joy." When the last wagon had disappeared down the road, Seth and Rebecca stood alone on the porch of the cabin their home, now truly shared. "Mrs. Prescott," Seth said softly, taking her hands in his. "Welcome home." Rebecca smiled up at him, her heart so full she could barely speak. "I've been home since the day you brought me here," she said. "Now it's just official." Seth lifted her into his arms, laughing as she gave a small squeak of surprise. "Then allow me to officially carry my bride over the threshold." Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Everything was familiar: the table where they had shared countless meals, the fireplace where they had read together on winter evenings, the chair where Seth had sat that Christmas Eve when he first declared his feelings. Yet tonight, everything felt new, as if she were seeing it all for the first time. Seth set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her. "I have something for you," he said. "A wedding gift." "You've given me so much already," Rebecca protested. "One more thing." Seth reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document, offering it to her. Rebecca opened it, her eyes widening as she read. "This is the deed to Sunrise Ranch," Seth confirmed, "with both our names on it, equal partners in everything now." Tears filled Rebecca's eyes as she looked up at her husband. "Seth, I don't know what to say. You once told me that Daniel never let you see the family accounts, that everything was his alone," Seth said, his expression serious. "I want you to know that everything I have is yours, not as a gift or charity, but because we're building this life together." Rebecca placed the deed on the table and wound her arms around his neck. "I love you, Seth Prescott, more than I ever thought possible." His arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Rebecca Prescott. You asked once what I wanted in return for helping you that day in Tucumcari. Your answer was my smile," Rebecca remembered. "Yes," Seth said, his eyes warm with love. "And every smile you've given me since has been more valuable than the price I paid that day." Rebecca smiled up at him, then a smile of joy, of love, of promise for all the days to come. "Then consider yourself the richest man in the territory, Mr. Prescott, because I plan to give you a lifetime of them." Seth's lips met hers in a kiss that sealed their vows more profoundly than any ceremony could, a kiss that marked the beginning of their life together as equal partners, bound not by ownership or obligation, but by the strongest bond of all: love freely chosen, freely given. Spring turned to summer, and life at Sunrise Ranch took on new rhythms as Rebecca and Seth adjusted to their roles as husband and wife. The practical aspects of their daily routine changed little. They had already established efficient patterns of work and cooperation during her time as housekeeper. But now there was a new intimacy, a deeper connection that transformed even the most mundane tasks into expressions of their growing love. Mornings began with them waking in each other's arms, sharing quiet conversations before the day's work began. Evenings ended the same way, sometimes with passionate embraces, sometimes with gentle companionship, but always with the profound sense of belonging they had both sought for so long. In July, Rebecca received news that confirmed what she had begun to suspect. She was expecting their first child, due to arrive in early winter. When she told Seth, his face transformed with wonder and joy. He knelt before her chair, placing his hands gently on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered, looking up at her with eyes bright with emotion. "Our baby." Rebecca covered his hands with hers. "Are you happy?" "Beyond words," Seth assured her, rising to take her in his arms. "I never dared hope for so much happiness, Rebecca. You've given me more than I dreamed possible." As summer waned and autumn approached, Rebecca's body changed, her slender frame softening with the new life growing within her. Seth was attentive and protective, insisting she rest more and taking on additional household duties. Elena Mendez visited often, bringing herbal teas for morning sickness and sharing wisdom from her own experiences as a mother. "He will be a wonderful father," Elena observed one afternoon as they watched Seth in the corral, gently training a young colt. "The way he is with animals, so patient, so kind, this is how he will be with your child." Rebecca nodded, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. "I know, it's one of the many reasons I love him." The autumn harvest was abundant, the ranch prospering under their combined efforts. Seth sold cattle at excellent prices, allowing them to make improvements to the property: a new pump for the kitchen, expanded chicken coops, fresh paint for the cabin's exterior. They also began work on a new room for the baby, Seth crafting a cradle from pine harvested from their own land. As winter approached, bringing the anniversary of Rebecca's arrival at Sunrise Ranch, she often reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here, from the desperate young woman being sold by her husband to cover his debts, to a beloved wife and soon-to-be mother, co-owner of a thriving ranch. "What are you thinking about?" Seth asked one evening as they sat before the fire, his hand absently stroking her hair as she leaned against him. "How differently things might have turned out," Rebecca replied honestly. "If you hadn't been in Tucumcari that day, if you hadn't intervened." Seth's arm tightened around her. "I've thought about that too. What if I'd arrived an hour later? What if I'd taken the northern road instead?" "Do you believe in fate?" Rebecca asked, tilting her head to look up at him. Seth considered the question seriously. "I believe that good people must act when they see wrong being done. And I believe that sometimes life gives us second chances we don't expect." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Meeting you was my second chance, Rebecca." December brought heavy snows and bitter cold. The baby was due in January, and Seth insisted on having Elena stay with them as the time approached, unwilling to risk Rebecca being alone if labor began during a blizzard when he might be out tending to the livestock. Elena arrived 2 weeks before Christmas, bringing gifts and holiday cheer that brightened the cabin despite the howling winds outside. Rebecca was grateful for her presence, not only for her experience with childbirth, but for her calming influence and practical assistance as Rebecca's mobility decreased with her advancing pregnancy. Christmas Eve came with clear skies and a full moon that made the snow-covered landscape glow with ethereal beauty. Seth built a magnificent fire, and they exchanged simple gifts: a new hat Rebecca had secretly made for Seth, a rocking chair he had crafted for her to nurse the baby. As they sat together that night, Seth with his arm around Rebecca, Elena knitting by the fire, Rebecca felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it, my love?" Seth asked, noticing her tears. "I was just thinking about last Christmas," Rebecca explained, wiping her eyes with a smile. "Our first kiss, your proposal, and now here we are a year later with our child about to join us." Seth's hand moved to rest on her rounded belly where the baby kicked vigorously against his palm. "Best Christmas gift I could ever receive," he said softly. New Year's Day dawned bright and cold. Rebecca woke feeling unusually energetic after weeks of fatigue. She insisted on helping Elena prepare a special dinner, moving about the kitchen with more vigor than she had shown in weeks. "The baby has dropped," Elena observed with an experienced eye. "It will not be long now." She was right. That evening, as they cleared away the dinner dishes, Rebecca felt the first contraction, a tightening across her abdomen that took her breath away. Seth was immediately at her side, his face a mixture of concern and excitement. "Is it time?" Rebecca nodded, unable to speak as another contraction followed quickly after the first. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. Elena proved invaluable, her calm direction guiding both Rebecca and Seth through the labor. Seth refused to leave his wife's side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement as she worked to bring their child into the world. Just after midnight, with a final tremendous effort from Rebecca, their son was born, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and a lusty cry that filled the cabin. "Samuel," Rebecca whispered as Elena placed the swaddled infant in her arms. They had chosen the name months earlier, Samuel, after Seth's father, with Javier as his middle name in honor of their dear friend. Seth sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes filled with wonder as he gazed at his wife and son. "He's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're both perfect." Elena slipped quietly from the room, leaving the new family to their private joy. Seth stretched out beside Rebecca on the bed, his arm supporting her as she cradled their son. "Thank you," he said, pressing a kiss to her damp hair. "For our son, for your love. For everything you are." Rebecca leaned against him, exhausted but radiant with happiness. "We've come so far," she marveled, watching Samuel's tiny fingers curl around her own. "From that day in Tucumcari to this moment." "And we have so much farther to go together," Seth replied, his gaze taking in his wife and child with profound love. As the first dawn of the new year broke over Sunrise Ranch, painting the snow-covered valley with hues of pink and gold, Rebecca Barnes Prescott looked out the window at the beautiful land she now called home, then back at the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, and finally at the perfect child they had created together. The journey that had begun with despair and humiliation had led to this moment of transcendent joy. From property to be sold, to beloved wife and mother. From a woman who had lost everything, to one who had gained a world beyond imagining. Seth had once told her all he asked for was her smile. As she gazed at her husband and son in the gentle light of morning, Rebecca smiled a smile of pure, unalloyed happiness that came from the depths of her soul. It was a gift freely given, the most authentic expression of the love that had transformed both their lives. And in that smile was the promise of all the years to come, years of partnership, of growth, of the family they would build together at Sunrise Ranch, where a new dawn had truly begun for them both.